Hello, and welcome to this lecture entitled The Woman Question in the Progressive Era. Much of what we think of as women's history in the Gilded Age and Progressive Era is more properly middle-class women's history. It's certainly true that in many realms, particularly those occurring in law, that treated working-class, middle-class, and upper-class women equally badly, there exists a distinctively gendered history. Women of the era strove for equality and self-possession before the law. But in social and cultural areas governed by less rigid rules, what appears to be a woman's movement for equality was really more about the middle class trying to come to terms with dramatic social spaces created by rapid industrialization. When we rightly speak about the so-called new woman, for example, we're talking about opportunities for changes in the status of middle-class women. Upper-class women had been able to use their wealth to open opportunities as they saw fit, while working-class women had generally worked for pay both inside and outside the home and were stymied in their possible ambition by too little money overall. It was the middle class who sought better education, later marriage, fewer children, more of a public face, and respectable employment outside the home. Now, I want to provide an overview of these areas of reform, then concentrate on two major campaigns that use the talents of middle-class women and which we normally associate with the progressive era, that is Prohibition and women's suffrage. These areas that I'd like to talk about begin with philanthropy, charity, social work, then go through advanced education and professional employment for women, then to clubs and local reform, and then, of course, to temperance, prohibition, and suffrage. Let's look first at philanthropy, charity, and social work. To some extent, we've already discussed this, but let's talk about it a little bit more now. After the Civil War, women entered the field of city reform, one branch of which was philanthropy, to combat social ills as they saw them. Much like the railroads that were too capital intensive to be able to work on the old single owner or partnership model and had to amass capital, reforming philanthropy was bigger than most individuals could do on their own. So the real change that we see is in the building of philanthropic infrastructure, that is, organizations and networks. In 1906, for example, Olivia Sage inherited a large fortune from her robber baron husband, and the following year, 1907, established the so-called Russell Sage Foundation in his name to support women's higher education, social survey projects, and more importantly, a network of other institutes and foundations that also did the work of study and reform. The Sage Foundation built a model working-class suburb in Queens, New York between 1909 and 1922, spending about a third of its endowment on that. But housing prices rose so quickly in the 1920s that workers were priced out of the market for their own suburb. The Sage Foundation also did some mammoth social conditions surveys and contracted others. The foundation exists today to study issues of income inequality. Now, we've already spoken a bit about charity work, particularly the Charity Organizations Society, but let's talk again about it here. As industrialization, oddly enough, spread poverty and the breakdown of community and mutual aid, independent groups, mostly women, emerged to ameliorate the problems and fight political machines to stop delivery of outdoor relief to poor men, which they considered vote buying and which they considered not going to the families. Individually, these reform and philanthropy groups could do little. In Germany, however, in 1877, the cities groups merged into a confederation, and that spread to England and the U.S. This is the Charity Organizations Society, called COS. Middle-class and upper-class women volunteered to be friendly visitors to the poor and immigrants, and simultaneously gained the right to distribute welfare to women and children. They distinguished between the deserving and the undeserving poor and provided aid accordingly. The COS opened the door to social work and the casework model that includes investigation of individual recipients, expectation of behavioral conformity, intense record keeping, and continual monitoring. Let's talk now about higher education and professional employment. Women's higher education had not progressed much beyond the finishing school stage until well after the Civil War. A number of colleges opened specifically for women in the liberal arts, such as the Seven Sisters in the Northeast, which are considered the equivalent to the all-male Ivy League. Many men's colleges eventually opened their doors to women, though the so-called co-eds remained a small number of students until after World War II. Iowa State University opened as coeducational in 1868, the first state land-grant school to be co-ed since its beginnings. In addition, George Washington Carver received his bachelor's and master's degrees from Iowa State, and Carrie Chapman Catt, who we'll talk about in a moment regarding suffrage, also graduated from Iowa State. Generally, women in these schools took courses in home economics that was much more about educating women to conduct applied research in their homes than it later became. In 1908, social reformers organized the American Home Economics Association as an academic, professional, and advocacy group. In addition, so-called normal schools, that is, teachers' colleges, flourished as women sought a higher public profile. These normal schools usually offered 2-year courses in elementary education overwhelmingly to women. One of the most significant problems with educating women was that they had a difficult time finding satisfactory living arrangements outside of marriage. Jobs were few and far between, but marriage often forced women to lose themselves to take on the mantle of homemaker, subservient to her husband and overeducated for those tasks. So what did they do? Let's talk now about clubs and local reform. Many women who had advanced education or not expanded their place in the public world by joining women's clubs. These were generally middle-class and upper-middle-class women of sufficient leisure and a sense of community outside the family. Most clubs in what became the General Federation of Women's Clubs after 1895 were study groups, but some were service-oriented. Those clubs often worked in tandem with other municipal activists who wanted to reform things like child labor laws, create juvenile courts, make refuges for unwed mothers, advance the idea of kindergartens, and engage in the City Beautiful movement that wanted to eradicate slums, create parks, etc. Because so much of this appeared to be an extension of women's ongoing roles as caregivers and, in the Victorian mind, providers of a home refuge against the storms of public life, these reforms came to be called municipal housekeeping. Now let's move on to the larger issues of prohibition and suffrage. Prohibition and suffrage campaigns were similar. They succeeded by narrowing their interest from generalized reform to single-issue reforms. Paradoxically, they succeeded by arguing that single issues within the broad tradition of middle-class reform was viable. They succeeded when they argued that they were bulwarks against a tide of foreigners and undesirable behavior. And both argued that they were necessary so women could protect themselves against manhood run rampant or manhood acting irresponsibly. So let's look at these reforms individually. Prohibition emerged from the temperance movement that began in the so-called early national period of 1789 to about 1825. Antebellum prohibition was tied to abolitionism. Temperance blasts onto the American scene as virulent revenge against demon rum in the 1870s and 1880s. Part of this was a loss of traditional community and a fear of immigration, and much of it was resurgent Protestantism and a work for the Lord mentality. This occurred in a stretch from North Carolina through the Upper South to Texas and Kansas. And all of these states held at least one election in which prohibition was the largest interest. Most states adopted prohibition education in schools as well. What about alcohol consumption in the U.S.? Consumption of alcohol in the U.S. was remarkably high, as were most Americans apparently. In 1825, Americans consumed 7 gallons of pure alcohol per person per year. That is, counting people 15 years old and older. Most of this was from whiskey. Now think about the equivalency like this. Today's most common proof of whiskey is 80. That is 80 proof, or 40% alcohol by volume. To get to 7 gallons of pure alcohol, you'd have to drink 17.5 gallons of 80 proof whiskey, or what we call tailgating. This amount dropped to 2 gallons of pure alcohol by the end of the Civil War, but beer replaced whiskey as the most popular alcoholic beverage and was tied to Eastern European and German immigration. World War I and Prohibition reduced that to half, and it rebounded by the 1960s to 2.8 gallons of pure alcohol per year. Let me put this another way and change the measure just a little bit. In 1915, Americans aged 15 and over drank an average of 32.2 gallons of alcoholic beverages per year, mostly beer. That is a bunch of 12-ounce bicep curls. The organization that led the temperance movement was a women's group, the Women Christian Temperance Union, WCTU. It was founded in Fredonia, New York in 1873 and thought alcoholism resulted from social issues rather than being a personal weakness. This led the WCTU to its peculiar public attack on vice and its interest in various other social reforms like reform of prostitution and other things. There are some leaders of note here that we want to discuss. Frances Willard was a suffragist and member of the WCTU, which was a common combination. And Carrie Nation, also known as Carrie A. Nation, was a bar breaker. She got in 1900 her call from God to destroy saloons. She was arrested 30 times for doing so between 1900 and 1910. Here are these ladies right now. Willard on the left and Carrie Nation with her axe on the right. Another organization was the Anti-Saloon League that was not a women's organization, but since we're talking about prohibition, let's go ahead and talk about it. It was run by men who had social and cultural connections to the levers of legal power. It was founded in Oberlin, Ohio in 1893. It wanted anti-alcohol legislation, not personal reform, and it did not use social suasion but the force of law to get what it wanted. It became more prominent than the WCTU and more prominent than the Prohibition Party after 1895. It became the first U.S. lobbying group focused on a single issue. It used a business-like bureaucracy and promotion from within to form strong organizational ties. It used modern propaganda techniques, and it was a male-driven organization that behaved differently than a splinter political party. It sought, in this order, local option laws, that is, allowing localities to vote whether they wanted to be dry or wet. Then it wanted statewide prohibition votes. Then it sought a national prohibition amendment to the Constitution. Its leaders were Howard Russell Hyde, a founder, Ernest Charrington, an editor, and Wayne Wheeler, a lawyer. They were successful with statewide prohibition by election between 1907 and 1909 in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Oklahoma, but they were unable to hold on to these gains and started losing them by 1908 through 1913. The Methodist General Conference of 1908 adopted the local option plank, and the passage of the 18th Amendment in 1919 and the Volstead Act of 1920 are directly connected to the Anti-Saloon League. Let's look at these leaders. Here you see Wheeler on the left, Hyde in the middle, who was the founder, and Charrington on the right, who was an editor. Now let's look at suffrage. Suffrage means the vote. There was a change in the suffrage movement from suffrage being one of a number of reforms to becoming a single issue. White middle-class women sought the right to vote. Let's look at the history of suffrage. The women's rights movement began really in 1848 with the articulation of the Seneca Falls Convention and the connection of women's rights with abolition. Women began to be able to vote in school elections. This is a continuation of their work in the home and their protection of children. In 1838, Kentucky allowed women to vote on school elections, 1861, Kansas, 1875, Michigan, and Minnesota, and between 1875 and 1890, 13 other states allowed this. Some western states allowed full female participation in state and local elections. For example, Wyoming in 1890, Colorado in 1893, and both Utah and Idaho in 1896. The organizational history of the women's suffrage movement is a little convoluted, so pay kind of close attention here. The first women's suffrage organization was the National Woman's Suffrage Association, founded in 1869 by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Another organization founded that same year was the American Women's Suffrage Association, founded by Henry Ward Beecher and Lucy Stone, and the reason two different organizations were founded was because of the wording of the 15th Amendment, which allowed African American men to vote, but not women. Anthony and Stanton demanded that the 15th Amendment be altered, and Beecher and Stone decided to take half a loaf. In 1890, these two groups put their problems aside and merged into one with the title National American Women's Suffrage Association. Between 1867 and 1917, 56 states held referenda on suffrage. There were 480 legislative campaigns carried out by one or the other or both of these groups. There were 277 party platform campaigns carried out by one or the other or both of these groups. There were 19 congressional lobbying campaigns, opening with the large parade in Washington, D.C. on March 3rd, 1913, the day before Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated. And that was the image that opened this particular lecture. Another group that was interested in suffrage but also interested in a wider body of women-specific reforms was the National Women's Party, organized in 1916 by the young Alice Paul. Now, Woodrow Wilson did not suffer these suffragists well. And when the National Women's Party protesters picketed the White House and chained themselves to the fence, he had them arrested for obstructing traffic. And they were, for all intents and purposes, tortured after refusing to pay fines. Eventually, in a 1919 to 1920 massive campaign, the 19th Amendment was passed. How many women were involved in this? Beginning in 1893, we count 13,150 women associated with the National American Women's Suffrage Association. By 1917, it claimed 2 million women. The leaders were Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was present at the Seneca Falls Conference of 1848 and the first president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association from its founding until 1892. Susan B. Anthony, who was a general reformer in abolition, labor, women's rights, and temperance, who appeared before every Congress from 1869 to 1906 and was president of National American Women's Suffrage Association from 1892, replacing Stanton, to 1900. Following her was Anna Howard Shaw, a physician and the first female Methodist minister in the U.S. She was English-born. She was president of National American Women's Suffrage Association between 1904 and 1915, and she is blamed for badly dividing the movement. Carrie Chapman Catt was president between 1900 and 1904. She preceded Anna Howard Shaw, and then she succeeded Anna Howard Shaw in 1915, becoming president until the dissolution of the association in 1920. It was Carrie Chapman Catt, remember she was from Iowa State, who reorganized the National American Women's Suffrage Association into a workable machine. And she organized the winning strategy platform of 1916 to narrow the focus of reform to women's suffrage only and to make an argument for a conservative reform that would allow white middle-class women the vote as a bulwark against the immigrant vote. Now let's also include in Suffrage Leaders Alice Paul, who lived until 1977. She was radically influenced by English suffragettes, and she wanted to press for a constitutional amendment much earlier than Catt did. So she founded the National Women's Party and engaged in direct action rather than lobbying, even after the U.S. went to war, which many people at the time found astonishing. Let me show you a slide of these leaders. You can see Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Mrs. Shaw, Carrie Chapman Catt, and Alice Paul. What kind of arguments did the suffragists use? One of their first arguments was the argument from justice, that women were governed by the same natural laws as men, and that American men had rebelled against suppression in 1776, claiming law and justice and equality with the English. The same natural law applied to women in America. And it was argued by broad-based reformers like Stanton and Anthony. Then there was the argument from expediency. They argued something more than natural law, justice, and equality needed to take place. Political liberty was becoming linked to political capacity by the 20th century, according to Eileen Creditor in her Ideals of the Women's Suffrage Movement. The National American Women's Suffrage Association argued that women's capacity for political liberty was based on their membership in the superior white race and the Anglo-Saxon ethnicity. Carrie Chapman Catt in particular argued that white American women's votes, like I said earlier, could counteract votes of undesirable foreigners. And she also argued that women needed the vote for self-protection better than men were protecting them. So in summary, the women's question was so much more than merely prohibition and suffrage, though it included those two reform campaigns as well. Women, principally of the middle class, wanted to rearrange their relationship to the public sphere and to men. They seized opportunities as they could to operate outside the home and break Victorian molds of so-called separate spheres. They volunteered for philanthropy and charity work that was the foundation of modern social work and became a profession open to women in the early 20th century. They sought higher education and to turn that education into gainful employment outside the home. Others joined women's club movement, while still others engaged in many municipal housekeeping reform movements like child labor laws and establishing juvenile courts, as well as the City Beautiful movement. Of course, women played lead roles in Prohibition, and at least until they were usurped by Progressive era men who had access to the law and could lobby. So women wanted the same kind of access, and in America that meant gaining the right to vote. So women engaged in the suffrage movement while other women opposed suffrage just as vehemently, a movement we have not discussed. The 19th Amendment passed in 1920 when the Tennessee legislature ratified it by one vote. The story of that vote is that in the last minute, the last person to vote received a call from his mother telling him he better vote for the amendment, and he did. This ends the lecture, and as always, thanks for your attention.